Before there was Auschwitz, there was Deir, ez-Zor, a place so notorious it could be considered the Armenian equivalent. During World War I, the Ottoman leaders embarked on a horrific campaign of ethnic cleansing that sought to redefine the empire's demographic landscape by eradicating the Armenian population. Thousands were marched into the desert to die, robbed, starved, beaten, and killed along the way. Over 1 million died, many in the most gruesome ways, and not one person has yet received justice. The Armenian Genocide is one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Ethnic Armenians were present in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, from 1500 BC. Following the arrival of the Seljuk Empire, Islamic Turks and the Armenians have lived as second-class citizens. As Christians, they were forced to pay for their government protection in the way of the jizya, a tax paid only by non-Muslims. Though persecuted, they were vital to domestic and international trade in the Ottoman Empire and were considered a loyal people, unlike the less trusted Greek and Assyrian Christians. In the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire began working on civil and religious reform, intending to end the legal discrimination of its many minorities. Despite these reforms, the situation for Armenians began to quickly deteriorate. Armenian populations were purposefully thinned out, as Armenian land was given to Muslim refugees, in the hopes that the reduced Armenian populations would result in a cultural and religious assimilation. The treatment of Armenians became so violent after 1876. With the ascension of Abdul Hamid II to Sultan, he wished to finally centralize the empire and bring stability. Stability, in the eyes of Hamid, relied on one people, under one God. As Christians, the Armenians, along with Greeks, Assyrians, and others, bore the brunt of this violent unification. The real bloodshed began with the establishment of the Hamidiyye regiments, used to harass and attack the Armenians, and they were given free rein to treat them as they wished. The Hamidiyye were comprised mostly of Kurds, to whom the Armenians had once paid their taxes until the abolition of the Kurdish Emirates. In 1895, the Armenians would receive a vision of what was to come. After decades of harassment, the three great powers of Britain, France, and Russia would force the declining Ottoman Empire to accept more legal reform, focused on ensuring the safety of Armenian Christians within the empire. These reforms were never implemented, and the Armenians assembled in Constantinople, now Istanbul, to protest and pressure the government into enacting these new laws. But the protesters were met only with violence from local police. Mass violence soon erupted, fueled by religious intolerance. The killing spread from Constantinople to neighboring vilayets, or counties. Soldiers and Muslim civilians attacked and murdered their Armenian neighbors, who they had once lived peacefully alongside. The violence continued until 1897. Almost 90,000 were killed. 550,000 were forced from their homes and into poverty. And 2,500 Armenian villages were razed to the ground. After decades of decline in the empire's wealth, power, and stability, revolutionary groups, collectively referred to as the Young Turks, overthrew the reigning government. The Young Turks wished to turn the Ottoman Empire into a modern constitutional monarchy built on parliamentary democracy and secularism. The revolution was welcomed by the religious minorities of the empire, who believed it would start a new era. Unfortunately, this was not the case. The Balkan Wars resulted in the loss of Ottoman possessions in the Balkans, and Ottoman Christians were blamed, while Turkish nationalist sentiments were encouraged. The Sultan's earlier wish for a fully Islamic empire was done away with, but replaced by the Young Turks' nationalist aims of a holy Turkish empire, free from supposed internal enemies. As had been the case years before, the Anatolian Christians were the first to be affected. The genocide begins. The Armenian Genocide began following the disastrous Battle of Sarıkamış in January of 1915, fought between the Ottomans and the Russians. Enver Pasha, commander of the Ottoman forces, personally blamed the Armenians for the loss. Villages were destroyed and people were killed during the retreat, as the Ottomans accused them of physically aiding the Russians. This lie and the presence of a few largely unpopular and unsupported revolutionary Armenian independent groups gave the justification for the pacification of the Armenian population. Governor Mehmed Rashid perfectly highlights the Ottoman view of the Armenians. Either the Armenians were to eliminate the Turks, or the Turks were to eliminate the Armenians. I did not hesitate when I was confronted with this dilemma. On the question how I, as a doctor, could have murdered, I can answer as follows. The Armenians had become hazardous microbes in the body of this country. Well, isn't it a doctor's duty to kill microbes? Clarence Usher was an American physician and missionary who witnessed the bloodshed of the beginning of the genocide. He was sent to serve as a physician in the town of Van at the turn of the 20th century. On his arrival, he noted that the population was still devastated from the Hamidiye massacres almost 30 years prior, and the orphanages still filled with parentless children. Governor Cevdet Bey arrived in the area in March 1915 with a band of thousands of soldiers and Kurdish and Circassian warriors. Cevdet was notorious for his brutality and had been given the nickname Nalbund Bey, meaning Lord Blacksmith. The horse-riding Kurds and Circassians were let loose on the populations of the surrounding villages, whom they cut down and shot from horseback. Afterward, the men of another town were rounded up, 2,500 of them, and killed in groups of 50. The property and the women and children were then distributed amongst the Turks, who took them as spoils of war. Nearby villages sometimes put up resistance, but rarely succeeded. The massacres in the area resulted in 55,000 deaths, according to Usher. Death marches. The genocide began with massacres, but soon evolved into a more calculated extermination. The first to be deported were the inhabitants of Cilicia, who were transported to relatively hospitable central Anatolia. Soon they were deported again to the Syrian desert, where they were more likely to die. Armenians were marched in their thousands to concentration camps in the deserts of northern Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, where those who had not died on the march were executed. No one was safe from the genocide, not even the wealthy or those in government. Christine Hagopian from Izmir was 9 years old when the killing began. Her father was a government worker and so believed he and his family were protected. When all Armenians were ordered to assemble at the church, her father ignored the command. They were visited by soldiers in the night, who dragged them out of bed. The father was ordered to lie on the floor and violated by the Turkish soldiers, as the family was forced to watch. Edward Rakubian was one of a caravan of 10,000 Armenians, forced to march towards the Euphrates River. All along the way, the route was lined with corpses of previous victims, bloated and decomposing. Without food or water, he and others were forced to suck on wet mud to quench their thirst. When they reached the Euphrates, it was littered with bodies, old and new. Despite the rotting flesh floating amongst it, they drank from the river, as there was no other source. After crossing the river and continuing on their journey, there were only 300 left. Rakubian and his mother took refuge with Arab nomads. His mother soon died, and he lived a harsh life under his new masters, being deprived of food and beaten. These depraved acts were experienced by hundreds of thousands. During the march, they fell victim to unprovoked violence, not only from the Turkish guards, but also from Circassian and Kurdish mobs living along the route. There was no attempt to protect them from the violence, and it was often encouraged. Women were victims of sexual assaults, and many children were taken away from their families in the hopes that they could be Turkified and converted to Islam. Disease was prevalent, and many died of hunger or dehydration, forced to eat grass, the flesh of rotten animals, or drink from dirty, contaminated streams and puddles, while those who could not keep up were shot or left behind to die. Those Armenians with money, if they hadn't already been robbed by guards or angry mobs, were able to purchase food and water. Arpyar Masikian was one of those lucky few, but found the flour that made the bread his father purchased was mixed with sand. Those who survived the long journey may have considered themselves lucky, but not for long. They soon discovered that their new home was nothing but a barren desert. There were no homes, no food, and little water, and no provisions for normal life, such as potential employment or the ability to farm. One of the worst camps was situated near the town of Ras Al Ain, near the Syria-Turkey border. Refugees started arriving in September 1915, mostly women and children. The refugees were at the mercy of the locals, and in one instance, 500 women were stripped naked and attacked by Turkish guards and local Chechens. These depravities would be repeated day after day. The first massacre in the camp was ordered by Jedvet Bey and resulted in 50,000 Armenians being killed. Other massacres were conducted for reasons of hygiene, as entire encampments were killed to prevent the spread of typhus and other diseases. Along with the murders, hundreds died every day from hunger and disease. The Ottoman governor of Baghdad, who personally witnessed the atrocities, commented, "The extermination of the Armenian people will become the darkest page of Turkey's history." Another camp existed in the desert on the outskirts of Deir ez-Zor, a name considered by some to be the Armenian equivalent of Auschwitz. Unlike Auschwitz, there was no forced labor or gas chambers, nor any organization. They were camped in an open-air prison, and just like Rez al-Ain, were simply left to die. Many died from exposure and disease, while others were killed by their Turkish overseers for sport. In between rounds of mass executions, people languished in poverty, stripped of all their valuables and dignity. Some hope would come for the Armenians of Deir ez-Zor after they were ordered to once again march to a new camp. The local governor, a Syrian Arab called Fadel al-Abud, took mercy on them and gave them not only food and shelter but also employment. Fadel, a doctor, had earlier tried to help control the epidemics within the camp, but his help had been consistently refused. As British forces advanced through Turkey into the Levant in 1917-1918, they liberated hundreds of thousands of Armenians, forced to labor for the Ottoman army, or enslaved by Arab tribes. Following their defeat in World War I, much of Turkey and the other regions of the Ottoman Empire were occupied by Britain, France, Russia, and Greece. Following the pacification of the empire, the Armenians began their Vorpahavak, meaning gathering of infants. Thousands of kidnapped Armenian children were taken from their adoptive Muslim parents and given back their Armenian names and cultures. And the thousands of children in orphanages searched for their parents, unaware if they were alive or dead. When the genocide came to an end, over 1 million had been killed and hundreds of thousands more had been displaced. Those that did survive were left with nothing. Their land had been taken, their homes destroyed or squatted by strangers, and their wealth stolen by others, or taken as bribes from their Turkish captors.